and I will turn it over to McKenna to get us started.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Violetta. And thank you all for joining tonight. It's always appreciate you taking time after a long work day. My name is McKenna Wong, and I am a project manager here at San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District, or Shoreline for short. And I am joined on our team by Chuck Anderson from Schaff and Wheeler, who is the lead engineer for a consultant team on this project, and he'll be available to answer any questions following the presentation with me. And then we also have our newest member of the One Shoreline team joining us tonight, Summer Bundy, who is our new director of projects at One Shoreline. And she is also here representing One Shoreline as well. And with that, I'll go ahead and start the presentation. I'll be covering 6 topics tonight. Introducing you all to One Shoreline in case you're not already familiar, talking through the project area in Millbrae and Burlingame, the need for a shoreline resilience project, the objectives and constraints that we're wrestling with this project, talk through the progress on this project to date. And then going towards the meat of the presentation, we'll talk through the updated set of 3 draft alternatives for the project that we're seeking your input on, as well as an updated set of draft criteria that we're using to compare the alternatives to each other and select a preferred alternative. And finally, we'll close with next steps. I have these little icons throughout the presentation. Like Violetta mentioned, we'll be prompting you via Zoom to have some engagement and interaction in this virtual format. So when this icon is pictured, we'll pause the presentation and seek your input via the Zoom polls. And finally, you'll see this throughout the presentation. I may or may not call it out, but it can be there for your reference in the slides that we'll share following today, where you can learn more about any of these topics further on our project website. With that, I'll jump into an introduction to One Shoreline. I think many of you on this call are probably familiar, but just in case there are a few that aren't. Before 2020, when One Shoreline was created, the primary agency that was charged with thinking about the issue of flooding in San Mateo County was the San Mateo County Flood Control District. And this was a longstanding district created in the 1960s that worked in a very limited area in San Mateo County in 4 flood zones that are shown in that image on the left-hand side of the screen there. Those 4 zones covered about 10% of the land area of the county. They barely touched the bay shoreline. You can see that yellow flood zone there on the bottom right. It's barely touching, and there's no jurisdiction in those 4 flood zones on the Pacific coast side of the county. So when the county completed a sea level rise vulnerability assessment in 2018, and there were more findings that were showing that San Mateo County, because we're on a peninsula and surrounded by water on both sides, that we are actually the county in California that is most at risk from sea level rise in terms of people and property that are in that sea level rise floodplain. Became very clear that climate change was a transformative issue, that the county individually through the flood control district or the cities individually were just not well equipped to address on an individual basis. And there was this call to establish a special district that could work across jurisdictional lines to address this issue head on. In response to that, state legislation established One Shoreline January 1st, 2020. So we are 4 years old. Almost 5 years old, and we are the first independent government agency in the state of California that is focused on building resilience to the water-related impacts of climate change. And that is very intentionally broad because we look to take a holistic approach in all of the work that we do. First, we take a holistic approach to the threats. So flooding and sea level rise, of course, are in our name, and so we're very focused on that. Also on the coast side, there are a lot of erosion issues that we have been created to address, as well as stormwater, more localized stormwater issues, and where they intersect with regional multi-jurisdictional areas. That leads me to the second. We take a holistic approach to geography. This is really the heart of why One Shoreline was created, is to facilitate that collaboration across jurisdictional lines and with asset owners that aren't cities or counties or towns like SFO, the San Francisco International Airport, and we'll talk more about that. And we also seek to take a holistic approach to our objectives. So of course, flood protection is a core objective of all of our projects. But as you'll see with the Millbrae and Burlingame Shoreline Resilience Project, we are seeking to meaningfully address habitat, recreation, connectivity, and community enhancement benefits as part of our projects as well. A key focus of our work is on the San Francisco Bay shoreline of San Mateo County, given how urbanized and low-lying a lot of this part of the county is. And we term our portfolio of projects on San Mateo County's Bay Shoreline, One Shoreline's Bay program. The objective of that program is to align and connect the protection and enhancement along the entire 53 miles of the San Mateo County shoreline. What that looks like is taking projects that are led by others or have already been completed. For example, the Foster City Levee project that was completed, that's in the center of that image there, as well as SFO's Shoreline Protection Program, which is being led independently by SFO. That's that orange line along the perimeter of the airport. So we're looking to take those projects that are led by others and connect the dots and stitch those projects together and close the gaps between those projects all along San Mateo County's shoreline. And this gap, well, first you can learn more about all of our work that covers a lot of the Bay program on our website. But we'll zoom in today on this area just to the north and south of San Francisco International Airport, of course, because the focus of our call today is that orange line to the south of SFO, the Millbrae and Burlingame project. So you may or may not be familiar, but San Francisco International Airport is in the process of designing its shoreline protection program, which is all along the perimeter of the airport to protect the airport from the 100-year storm event, which I'll define a little later, as well as 3.5 feet of sea level rise. And given the number of communities in San Mateo County that are just to the north and south of the airport or tucked in behind the airport, like San Bruno and Millbrae, that experience flooding today, that during high tides and storm events, it has been a key focus of One Shorelines to look to leverage SFO's project and connect to it on the north and south sides to provide that contiguous line of protection against current and future storms with sea level rise. And that orange line just to the south of SFO is the Millbrae and Burlingame Shoreline project that we'll focus on today. Okay, so let's get oriented to the project area. Just south of SFO, you have SFO to the north and San Mateo and Coyote Point off the map to the southeast. And one complicated aspect of this project area, I'll elaborate on this a little bit more later in the presentation, is that there are 6 openings in this shoreline that drain this area during rainfall events, but also could take on water when there's high tides as well. We have 4 creeks, Highline Canal and El Portal Creek in the city of Millbrae. El Portal Creek is right on the border between Millbrae and Burlingame. And then within Burlingame, we have Mills Creek and Easton Creek, as well as 2 lagoons, Anza Lagoon and Burlingame Lagoon. And I'll pause here to ask for your input on what your familiarity is with the project area and maybe what brought you here today. I'll pause for you to launch that poll, Violetta.
Thanks, McKenna. So I'm launching the poll. You should see that in front of your screens. All right, giving folks another couple seconds. Most of you have answered. Okay. So sharing the results, it looks like 3 of you live or work in Millbrae, 3 of you live or work in Burlingame. And 1 person recreates there, and another is generally interested in resilience projects, and 2 people have a different reason for being here. If you'd like to share that in the chat, we're interested. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good spread across all the different options.
Thank you.
Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and move ahead here, kind of transitioning into the need for this project and our objectives and the constraints that we're wrestling with. So this is the current FEMA 100-year floodplain pictured for the project. FEMA stands for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and that agency creates maps that illustrate what areas are subject to flooding from the 100-year storm. And the 100-year storm is the storm of a large significant storm event that has about a 1% chance of happening in any given year. And unfortunately, with climate change, the chance of that storm happening is actually increasing over time. But this is historically what is the 100-year event. And a lot of properties in this project area are in the FEMA floodplain, and the majority of that water, as it's modeled to flood this area, is coming from San Francisco Bay. It's coastal flooding. So not as much of the overtopping from creeks, but more water that is coming from San Francisco Bay and inundating this area. So that leads me to our second question. Have you been personally impacted by flooding, whether it's in the project area or in other parts of San Mateo County?
Okay, let me launch that one. Another couple seconds here. Okay. Here are the results.
Let's see. A lot of people know others who've experienced flooding, but also some have experienced themselves. Okay, let me go ahead and move ahead here. Layering on the sea level rise floodplain for this area. This area is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise. Nearly this entire project area was artificial fill, was land created since the 1850s or 60s. And so it's incredibly low lying and vulnerable to sea level rise. Both the cities of Burlingame and Millbrae completed studies looking at this issue for these two cities and actually began to scope the project that has led to this regional project today. And those two studies had found that the estimated value of properties impacted in this area from sea level rise totaled nearly 2.4 billion, a significant amount of property value. And that's just looking at this through the lens of property value, right? Which we know is not a full indication of the value of this area, both in terms of recreational value as well as ecological value. And then finally, this area is also incredibly vulnerable to shallow groundwater rise. This is an emerging issue that Shoreline is still getting a sense of how do we incorporate and into the project design, but this is also an incredible threat in the Millbrae and Burlingame shoreline area. So pivoting to the project objectives. So the overall project goal for the Millbrae and Burlingame Shoreline Resilience Project is long-term climate resilience against sea level rise and extreme storms for developed natural and public access areas. And the way this translates into three project objectives. First is coastal flood protection. How can we protect the shoreline area against those hazards that I showed earlier, both that are currently occurring and also in the future? Second is establishing a functioning habitat. How can we facilitate healthy and sustainable ecosystems along the shoreline? And based on our modeling, I'll allude to this a little bit more in future slides. We have seen that habitat features, both existing along the shoreline today, but also ones that could be developed as part of the project, could help us meet the coastal flood objective that's shown in the first box there. Our objective overall is to maintain softer, shallower slopes that could facilitate the natural reformation of habitats that were lost in this area, and also can help those habitats migrate as sea levels rise. The really difficult and challenging thread needle that we have to thread here is balancing this with the very close proximity that this project has to SFO, and making sure that we are not attracting high flying birds to this area. And so we will have to be figuring out how do we not actively create or plant new habitat that can do that while also facilitating a healthy and sustainable ecosystem. So we'll have to find that balance here. And the third project objective is focused on public access and recreation. There's a lot of existing benefits, recreational benefits to the shoreline, and how we're looking to enhance the shoreline area experience both today and then in the future as sea levels rise. Now spending some time on the very difficult project constraints for this project. So one of the first difficult aspects of this area that I alluded to earlier is the fact that there are 6 creeks or lagoons in this project area. So we're looking, as part of this project, to elevate the entire shoreline area to protect from long-term sea level rise and flooding. But instead of just focusing on elevating that area, we also have to account for the 6 holes in the shoreline that have to remain open to allow for, when rain falls, allow the creeks and lagoons to drain to the bay and have that water exit into the bay. And then also when there's high tide and sea level rise, keep that water from going up the creeks and up the lagoons and flooding properties and area that are adjacent to the creeks and lagoons. So that's been one incredibly challenging aspect of designing these different alternatives. Second, and I emphasize this a lot in all of our workshops and the tour, is this area is heavily urbanized. Early in the project, we developed this map that's shown on this slide here, where we went through the exercise of mapping how much space exactly do we have to work with in the project area. And we first defined what we're calling a shoreline barrier back boundary. That's that lime green line that's going throughout the area. That's how close can we possibly get to existing development that's in this area? How close can we get to existing buildings as well as roads and parking lots? That's how that green line was defined. And then on the bay side, we defined what's within BCDC's bay jurisdiction. Essentially, that's defined by the high tide line, is how we defined the existing shoreline. And so the space between the green line and the blue line is shaded in purple, and that's what we mapped out as roughly what area is available. And you'll see it ranges from anywhere from non-existent. We actually have areas where that where existing development is actually encroaching into the shoreline, where you don't have adequate buffer off of those existing buildings to build shoreline infrastructure without bay fill. And then we have areas where there's more space, up to 216 feet wide in Bayfront Park, which is in Millbrae, really beautiful, more spacious area of the shoreline. And I'll just acknowledge these 2 areas here are now are part of new private developments. And so we're not counting that as complete open space in the same way that we're thinking about Bayfront Park. And so just the main message here is that existing and recently permitted developments that are along the shoreline in Burlingame have significantly limited the space that is available for this project. And so that's been a huge challenge to wrestle with. Third, the project must meet requirements to be accredited by FEMA, that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, so that areas that are on the landward side of this project are not subject to the flood insurance requirement. That's a key objective of this project. And so we must incorporate coastal flood protection measures that are acknowledged by FEMA as part of this project. So that is a constraint we need to operate around. And then finally, alluding to what I said earlier, we have to be very clear that we're not attracting new high-flying birds to this area as part of this project due to the proximity to SFO. All right, moving forward in project progress. To date, we kicked off this effort in March 2022, where we hired Chuck and his team and kicked off the project. Chuck's team got moving very quickly from July 2022 to September 2023, collecting data on the area and developing the first set of project alternatives. All of that work culminated in a report, a feasibility analysis that analyzed the first set of conceptual alternatives for the project, and this led to the release of a notice of preparation that initiated the CEQA process for the project in October 2023. And that notice of preparation included that image shown on the bottom of the screen there, illustrating 2 types of features of the project, both offshore and onshore. We received significant comments on the notice of preparation that were very informative and instructive to the project. And following the NOP release from November 2023 to just this past summer in May 2024, we reviewed those comments in a lot of detail, explored additional alternatives as a result, and hired an outreach consultant, Civic Edge, that's supporting us on this webinar today. Civic Edge and One Shoreline worked together to develop an outreach and engagement plan for this project that was presented to our board in August of 2024. And then we were moving into this fall now where we, in early fall, we're vetting this updated set of draft alternatives that replaced the more broad alternatives included in the notice of preparation with city partners, landowners, and permitting agencies. And now we're just now concluding this public engagement period on these updated draft alternatives. We will now move ahead into 2025, taking in all of your comments this fall and looking to establish what we're calling the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative, or the preferred project or preferred alternative out of these three alternatives. I'm just going to move towards the last time that this project was publicly discussed was through the notice of preparation. So I want to share a bit about what we heard in the NOP comments and how we've responded to those as part of these three draft alternatives. So first, we heard that a large offshore lagoon that was shown in that image with that purple line and the offshore features could impact water quality, including changing circulation, increasing pollutant, turbidity, temperature, salinity issues, as well as increasing the risk of algal blooms. Second, a large offshore lagoon, as shown in the NOP, could impact specific species and their habitats, and we heard very clearly from various commenters that nature-based solutions were a top priority. Third, a large offshore lagoon could attract wildlife, including high-flying birds at the risk of bird strikes to SFO. We also heard that a large offshore lagoon, particularly one that would extend to Coyote Point, would limit wind sport access in that area. And lastly, we also heard that a large offshore lagoon could impact views along the Millbrae shoreline in Bayfront Park. So in response to these comments, we do not plan to carry forward the large offshore lagoon alternative for further analysis, and the updated draft alternatives we'll talk through today primarily focus on shoreline features, and we also have a nearshore waterway alternative. Early modeling has indicated that smaller nearshore waterway footprint could have maximum tidal exchange or water exchange in that area that could address some of those water quality concerns, but we would have to do further studies if an alternative of that nature moves ahead as part of detailed design. Also, features that incorporate nature-based solutions and while also minimizing attracting high-flying birds are incorporated into all the alternatives. The alternatives no longer include an optional extension to Coyote Point. They all end at the San Mateo and Burlingame city boundary. And then in terms of view impacts along the Millbrae shoreline, two of the alternatives, A and B, were developed to have very little visual or public access impact at Bayfront Park. Okay, and then speaking a bit about nature-based solutions, you'll see throughout all the alternatives that we focus on having a gradually sloped shoreline, softer, shallower slopes, and you'll see those illustrated in the slides I'll share. With a 10-1 slope on the bay side, a bay trail at the top of that slope, and then on the landslide, that slope could vary, but at the steepest it would be 3-1. And you see this represented in the aerial images as that green area is looking at a conceptual level to illustrate that 3-1 slope up to a pink line that's illustrating the bay trail, and the blue areas illustrating the 10-1 slope, living shoreline slope, moving down to the bay bottom. And I'll elaborate a little bit on that in future slides. And the reason why we incorporated these nature-based solutions into all the alternatives is we found that a gradually sloped living shoreline provides two key benefits. First, we have found that shoreline elevations could actually be lower when you have that flatter gradual slope ahead of the bay trail. We don't have to build as high to protect from sea level rise when you have that more gradual slope on the bay side. And then also it's just a more appealing, attractive experience for both people and wildlife. It's a less abrupt transition from land to bay along this reach of the shoreline. So our vision for this project is something like this, the way that Bayfront Park looks like today, where you have that softer gradual slope down to the bay, rather than something like this. This is what you see in certain reaches of the Burlingame shoreline, where you have a seawall right now that's, you can actually peer over today, but if we elevated that seawall to protect from sea level rise, you wouldn't be able to see over that wall any longer. And that's not, we don't want to be building a fortress as part of this project. We want something that is a little more accessible, and you're able to still experience the bay. Okay, I'm finally transitioning into the 3 draft alternatives. I want to focus your attention on the first 2 reaches of the alternatives. There's 5 reaches along this shoreline, but the primary difference between these 3 alternatives lies in the area of the project in the first 2 reaches that cover the 4 creeks along the project area. So going into the 3 alternatives, first we have alternative A, and the focus of this alternative is to remain on the shoreline as much as possible. And so the way we do that, focusing on that area around the 4 creeks, is we're managing creek water at each creek mouth with a pump station and a tide gate at the mouth of each of those 4 creeks. Alternative B consolidates those 5 pump stations to 1 by managing creek water through a series of tunnels that route that creek water to 1 location. And so we're able to minimize the number of pump stations in alternative B. Alternative C does the same thing by consolidating pump stations, but it does that through a nearshore waterway. So it manages creek water, exiting these 4 creeks through a waterway that routes it to 1 location where it's pumped at 1 location. Just to summarize kind of the key advantages and disadvantages of each alternative before we jump into them, and I'll summarize this again at the end. So once again, alternative A, the focus here is to remain on the shoreline as much as possible. And so as a result, the key advantage is that it has the least amount of bay fill, about 70 acres of bay fill. Some disadvantages, it has the most number of pump stations, which are expensive and can be very energy intensive, especially as sea levels rise. That pumping will start to become more frequent and perpetual. Alternative B, some of the key advantages that reduces the number of pump stations. So it's consolidating that water to 1 location through those tunnels under a new shoreline park. And there's also a significant increase in shoreline park space because those tunnels are underneath new park area. Some key disadvantages is that there's constructing tunnels in the shoreline area would be incredibly challenging, both to construct and also to maintain over time. Key advantages of alternative C. Once again, you're reducing the number of pump stations. I'll speak to this a little later. There's an opportunity to restore fish passage to Highline Canal and El Portal Creek as a result of this alternative. And then because you're having this new reach of shoreline protection that creates the nearshore waterway, there could be an opportunity to create a new reach of the Bay Trail. Some key disadvantages, it has the most amount of bay fill, about 120 acres. It could impact views at Bayfront Park and Millbrae. And some of those water quality concerns that we heard in the notice of preparation could also carry forward here, where we would have to deal with water quality impacts as part of this alternative. So just to be clear, we do not have a preferred alternative at this time. And so feedback that we hear from you in this webinar and feedback that we've heard in many other events this fall are directly informing changes that will be made to these draft alternatives and the process we will go through to ultimately select a preferred alternative. Okay, so let's dive in to alternative A. So all these alternatives,
Yeah, sorry, we have a question that is relevant to all the explanations. Could you describe what a pump station is designed to accomplish? Pump out water that has already come in and flooded vulnerable areas, question mark?
That's a good question. So maybe Chuck, you can tag team me on this. But the key purpose of the pump stations you'll see throughout the alternatives is to allow for water when rain is falling and going into these creeks, draining to these creeks. It's trying to ensure that that water can get into the bay. So that's the main purpose of the pump stations, is to take water from the creeks and the lagoon areas and get that water into San Francisco Bay during high tide. So if that water can't naturally drain by gravity, it would need to be pumped. Is there anything you want to add to that, Chuck?
No, it's a great explanation. If there's a follow-up question, we could take it real quick, maybe.
So the follow-up do they only operate when flooding takes place? And it sounds like no, they operate at high tides.
Well, they would operate when there's a high tide and when there's stormwater runoff into the creeks that there's enough water to need to pump. Yeah. And it happens, there's a clear sunny day, high tide. If there's no runoff in the creek at all, then they would not be triggered.
Great question. Okay, so each of these alternatives have 5 reaches. And like I mentioned before, the differences between the 3 alternatives lies in those first 2 reaches, reach 1 and reach 2. For alternative A, this alternative ties into SFO's Shoreline Protection Program at that project's reach 15 is just the name of that reach that's closest to Highline Canal. And then on San Mateo's side, it ties into the San Mateo Bay Trail, right where Burlingame and San Mateo meet. Along Reach A1, this alternative proposes to raise and improve Bayfront Park in Millbrae to provide the flood protection required by regrading portions of the park. And like I mentioned before, alternative A is proposing a pump station and a tide gate at the mouth of every creek. And so pump stations would be constructed at the mouths of Highline and El Portal Creek. And both of these creeks have existing tide gates, and this alternative would leverage those existing tide gates along with those and install new pump stations. Along reaches A2 and A3, we're proposing that gradual slope to facilitate the creation of a living shoreline. A living shoreline could include nearshore reefs or oyster bag breakwaters that are shown by these gray squiggly cartoons there. That could create quieter nearshore intertidal areas for sediments to accumulate and potentially form coarse beaches that consist of sand, shell, gravel, or cobble, or clustered formations of sandbars, which is what the beige cartoon areas are attempting to show. The nearshore reefs would also provide places for oysters and other invertebrates to attach, as well as habitat for fish. And I'm also showing these cartoon vegetation throughout the living shoreline area. We wouldn't be planting vegetation as part of these alternatives, but they may occur due to that more gradual, softer conditions as part of the living shoreline. At the mouths of Mills and Easton Creek, pump stations with tide gates would be constructed as well. And then I'll just highlight this gray circle that just appeared here is illustrating a tide gate that without a pump station, where the existing stacked rubble outlet that's currently at the mouth of Anza Lagoon would be replaced by a tide gate where we could control the water levels within Anza Lagoon. Moving on to reach A4, east of Bayfront Channel, this creek that drains Burlingame Lagoon out to San Francisco Bay, right to the right of this is a vacant parcel. In 2021, the city of Burlingame passed an updated zoning ordinance that included a 100-foot buffer zone requirement. So any new shoreline development that is constructed in this vacant land would have to be set back 100 feet from the bay shoreline. So we're planning to operate within that 100-foot buffer zone. And within this space, we propose to improve and regrade this area as a new shoreline park that would provide the required flood protection against sea level rise. This revitalized park would also host a pump station that is connected to a tide gate at the mouth of Bayfront Channel. So this would allow, once again, like Chuck was mentioning, when there's rainfall events and also a high tide, when Burlingame Lagoon is filling with water, it would allow that water to get pumped out of Burlingame Lagoon during a high tide event. This is a very large pump station. Preliminary estimated footprint is around 30,000 square feet, and that's 3 to 4 times, just for scale, the size of these other 4 pump stations that are included as part of this alternative. Finally, closing out this alternative with Reach A5. Along this east shoreline of Burlingame Point, there was recently a redevelopment project completed there at 300 Airport Boulevard in 2021. And this existing shoreline that was constructed as part of that development is relatively steep. It's like a seawall. And to provide wave run-up resilience to prevent waves from overtopping the steep seawall with future sea level rise, we would look to reconfigure this area at a flatter slope to help break those waves along a more gradual slope. Okay, so that is all. Oh, and then finally, this pink line that just appeared here is illustrating the Bay Trail. So along this entire alternative, we are looking to improve and widen the existing Bay Trail as well as close existing gaps that total nearly a mile of the Bay Trail along this shoreline. The Bay Trail alignment would follow mostly like it is today in Millbrae and Bayfront Park. And then for the rest of the shoreline, in order to accommodate this more gradual slope in the living shoreline, we're proposing to shift the Bay Trail farther away from existing development and towards the bay. So that alignment, the pink alignment of the Bay Trail is shifting closer to the bay for the rest of this shoreline. Okay, moving towards alternative B, I'm going to pause in case there's any burning questions before I move towards that. Okay. Cool. So alternative B, everything that's in the red boxes that's shown here is the same as alternative A. So I'm not going to walk through all that again. I'm just going to walk through the primary differences with alternative B. So in alternative B, this along reach 1, B1, we're also proposing to raise and improve Bayfront Park and Millbrae. But what's different about this alternative now is we're looking to construct a new tunnel that would go underneath Bayfront Park that would help drain water from Highline Canal. So and this is inspired by Tunnel Tops Park in the San Francisco and the Presidio, in case you're familiar. There's this new beautiful park that was constructed over 2 tunnels that are transporting cars. So we're taking that same concept, but instead of cars underneath the Shoreline Park, it would be tunnels carrying water. And so along Bayfront Park and Millbrae, this tunnel would be 45 feet wide and would transport creek flows from Highline Canal down to El Portal Creek. Structures that would divert water from the creeks into the tunnels would be constructed at the mouths of Highline Canal and El Portal Creek. And like I mentioned before, there's existing tide gates at these creeks, and those tide gates would be used as part of these diversion structures. Along Reach B2, that tunnel continues. And so from El Portal Creek to Mills Creek, that tunnel would carry now water from 2 creeks, Highline Canal and El Portal Creek. That water would travel through this line here. And then Easton Creek, a tunnel would be constructed to divert water from Easton Creek up farther north. And all of those flows would discharge to the mouth of Mills Creek, where there would be a pump station that could pump that water out to San Francisco Bay when there's a high tide at the same time as a significant rainfall or storm event. And this pump station's preliminary footprint is around 35,000 square feet. So once again, a very large pump station. And as I mentioned earlier, we would look to improve and enhance the Bay Trail throughout this area. For this alternative, that Bay Trail alignment would follow the tunnel alignment. So it would be farther out into the bay along Reach 2 and 3. And then it would look to follow the existing Bay Trail alignment in Bayfront Park today along Reach 1. Okay, now moving to alternative C. Once again, what remains the same across all alternatives is already on the screen, and then I'll just highlight what's different about alternative C. First thing that's different is that it's tying into SFO at a slightly different location, farther into airport property towards the north along the Reach 14 of their shoreline protection project. Along Reach 1, flood protection would be provided by a vertical wall, a seawall that is matching SFO's existing or proposed seawall system as part of the shoreline protection project. And I'll explain a bit more about why that is in a bit. Along Reach C2, that wall would transition to a nearshore levee that would have that same gradual slope that could host a living shoreline. And that wall, as well as the levee, would create a 200-foot wide nearshore waterway that are controlled by a set of operable tide gates. Outside of extreme storms and tides, the operable gates would be kept open to allow for normal tidal action in and out of that nearshore waterway and allow for natural drainage from the 4 creeks out into the bay. But as sea levels rise in the coming years, these gates will need to be closed more frequently and for longer periods of time. And we're estimating just at this conceptual level, with about 3.5 feet of sea level rise, these tide gates could remain open for up to 15 hours a day, or about 60% of the time when there's not a significant storm event. The waterway would terminate at this orange box that just appeared here at a nearshore pump station, and that would be activated during periods of high tide that occur during a storm event. Finally, in terms of public access, as I mentioned earlier, this nearshore levee provides the opportunity to host a new reach of the Bay Trail that could occur along that nearshore levee. That new reach of the Bay Trail would terminate at a pedestrian bridge that would take pedestrians back to Bayfront Park, back to the existing Shoreline in Millbrae, and not allow them that access along the seawall to SFO property. So that's why there's this transition from a nearshore levee that's a wider footprint with a trail to something that's a little more structural. Finally, there are existing tide gates, like I mentioned earlier, at the mouths of Highland Canal and El Portal Creek. If an alternative like Alternative C was constructed, where you now have flood protection out as part of the nearshore waterway, the seawall farther out, you could potentially remove those existing tide gates and restore fish passage to Highland Canal and El Portal Creek. That could be an additional ecological benefit as part of Alternative C. Finally, it is possible to mix and match alternatives. So if we hear from users of Bayfront Park, from the city of Millbrae, that something like Alternative C would not work, that would block views for us, we really are focused on something like Alternative A or B. That's something that we could explore. And then have a similar conversation for other reaches of the shoreline, where we're looking at all three alternatives and selecting which one is the best for that reach of shoreline. So it is possible to mix and match these. So just to summarize one last time, Alternative A, we look to remain on the shoreline as much as possible through tide gates and pump stations at the mouths of each of the 4 creeks. Alternative B consolidates to one pump station using a series of park tunnels that are underneath a new reach of Shoreline Park. Alternative C consolidates to one pump station using a nearshore waterway. Some advantages: Alternative A has the least amount of bay fill, Alternative C has the most. And Alternative B has some disadvantages in terms of construction and maintenance of those tunnels, which could be very complicated. And let's see, finally, in terms of Alternative C, there's some benefits in terms of restoring fish passage to those 2 creeks in Millbrae, as well as a new reach of Bay Trail. There's a lot of trade-offs between these alternatives, and once again, we don't have a preferred alternative at this time. So I will pause here to seek your input. We'll have a series of polling questions for you to get your initial thoughts and reactions on these 3 alternatives.
Thanks, McKenna. So the first question I'm going to launch is regarding the habitat impacts and benefits from the 3 alternatives. So I'll launch that. So I'll read it out loud. All 3 alternatives include living shorelines, which will allow habitat to adapt as sea levels rise. How well do you think these alternatives meet the goal of facilitating healthy and sustainable ecosystems? Again, these are just pulse checks. We want to hear your feedback. There'll be time for more discussion once the presentation's over. Waiting on a few more people if you'd like to participate. All right. Seems pretty split here. Some people think well, very well, not well, and not sure. Okay, I'm gonna launch another poll here that deals with the recreation and public access aspects of the alternatives. So based on what you know so far, do you have a preference? Oh, I'm sorry. This was not what I wanted to launch. Here we go. Well, let's just do this one since I launched it. So based on what you know so far, do you have a preference for any one of these? Again, just a pulse check.
We have one request to launch the poll again, Violetta.
Oh. I'm not sure that I can do that. So sorry about that. I see 10 of you have replied. But if you'd like to Slack us your response, we can incorporate that. So here's the results from that. A couple people for A, a couple people for B. Some people don't feel like they have enough information, and others don't prefer one over the other at this point. Okay, and then one more here. All three alternatives include improvements to public access and recreation. What is your top priority related to public access and recreation? There's a couple choices here. Is it expanding the Bay Trail width to allow for multiple uses? Providing new opportunities for recreation, like new segments of the Bay Trail? Preserving existing uses like fishing and plane spotting that happen currently? Adding additional uses? All of the above or something else? Thanks for your responses here. I'll give last couple folks time if they want to reply to this one. Okay. Here are the results. Looks like expanding the Bay Trail is a clear priority. And some of the other results had responses as well. All right, thank you for that.
All right, closing this out. I know I'm just far over 30 minutes here, but we're near the end. So finally, we're looking for your input on some draft criteria that we plan to use to compare the alternatives to each other and ultimately select a preferred project alternative. So the first set of criteria really speak to the 3 project objectives that I mentioned earlier. Flood protection: does the alternative provide the required flood protection benefits? Does it allow local stormwater to drain properly? Habitat: does it harm or benefit current and future species? Public access and recreation: what does the alternative look like? How do you experience it when you're along the shoreline? And then some other criteria related to implementation: how an alternative will be implemented. Is it feasible to obtain the land rights and permits necessary to implement? What is the cost of the alternative? And schedule of implementation. Operations and maintenance: how will the alternative be operated and maintained both today or post-construction, and then also as sea levels rise and storms become more extreme? And then a key criteria that we're weighing is related to bird strikes and SFO, like I mentioned before, determining in detail what the alternative does in terms of increasing the likelihood for bird strikes. And we would like your input on this as well.
So these are the evaluation criteria, as McKenna just said. All of these will be taken into consideration, but we're interested if there's one that is most important to you. Or if you feel like something's missing from the evaluation criteria, you can select other, and then please chat or put in the Q&A what you think we should take into consideration.
Thanks, Robert. I'm seeing your comment on, or maybe it's a question on how it's funded, so I can address that in the Q&A.
All right, give folks a few more seconds here. Most of you have replied, but there's a few more people if you'd like to participate. All right, let's see. Flood protection criteria is important to folks. Operations and maintenance, recreation, and habitat.
Great, that's really helpful.
All right, thank you for that.
All right, pivoting to next steps, we're at the end of a long series of meetings that have been taking place over this fall and primarily in November. And we are now posting materials that were presented at all these events. So you can find information like the slides and the handouts on our website from our workshops. And then we'll also, like Violetta mentioned at the top of the meeting, be posting the recording of this webinar for reference. Moving ahead from this public engagement period this fall, we will be spending a lot of time rolling up our sleeves, putting our heads down in early 2025, analyzing the feedback that we received from you all this fall, refine and update the alternatives as a result of that feedback, and then begin the process of identifying the preferred alternative, which is coincident with the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. And that's something that's required as part of the permitting for this project. And we would be coordinating with permitting agencies on that and other key interested parties. We will then return to another series of public engagement events sometime in the summer with that draft preferred alternative and get your feedback on that before we then begin the draft EIR and complete 30% design on that preferred alternative. And with that, I will stop monologuing and would love to hear your questions and yeah, Chuck and I will do our best to address your questions.
Thanks, McKenna.
Yes.
Thanks everyone who's already put questions in the chat and in the Q&A feature. And David, I see your hand up. I'm going to take a couple questions that people have submitted first, and then David will go to you. Is there a meaningful difference between the three alternatives in terms of water throughput?
Maybe Chuck, you can take a step.
I'll take that one. No, there's not. As McKenna introduced, the main difference is kind of how we handle that throughput. So what's coming down from the hills and the local areas, that doesn't change based on what we do. The not quite that simple on the shoreline. How you present the different slopes on the shoreline does affect how high the waves run up on the shoreline. But in term, each of the three projects will perform the flood control function, period. That's sort of a pass-fail criteria, if that makes sense. So what's coming through is going to be the same. How we handle it would be different depending on the three alternatives, and really the four creeks to the northwest.
Thanks, Chuck. We've got a couple questions that I'll deal with maintenance. So who would maintain the pumps after construction? And then another one, could you talk about ongoing maintenance of the infrastructure in general? How is it accomplished? Ongoing costs of the maintenance. How are you taking that into consideration?
Yeah, some very practical thinkers in the audience. That's good. Yeah, I mean, maintenance responsibilities is something that's yet to be determined, and that would be conversations that would be had with the cities of Millbrae and Burlingame. So likely local city staff would be responsible for maintaining any infrastructure that's constructed as part of this project. And maybe Chuck, I can ask you to speak to on a high level what that could look like in terms of maintenance responsibilities.
Right.
Vary quite differently for all of these alternatives, of course, but
they do. So the first and foremost would be, in all of the alternatives, we have some number of pumps. Those need to be operated, fueled. Electrical power has to be provided. Those need to be maintained on an ongoing basis. The same would hold for if we did the tunnels. If sediment starts gathering in the tunnels, that needs to be cleaned out regularly. As you saw some of the recreational features, a bay trail needs to be maintained. There'd be amenities associated with that bay trail that need to be maintained. We'd probably have restrooms. Trash receptacles, all it needs to be maintained in like a park. It'd be like a city park that needs to be maintained. And just a lot of the infrastructure, frankly, is pretty low maintenance. For example, a living shoreline is meant to be kind of dynamic without a lot of work done on it. But over time, we might get big storms and things get moved around, need to be repaired. So there is absolutely a life cycle of maintenance that needs to be accounted for, and also in terms of funding, right? You can't build something and don't have and not have a mechanism for maintaining it over the long term. So that all gets factored in. And I think that really came under two banners on the criteria. That would be implementation that affects the long-term maintenance, and just looking at that long-term maintenance and what the costs are associated with that. In other words, and this isn't necessarily pick just the winner of the least cost. That's not how the LEDPA works, but we tend to look at life cycle costs, amortizing that over a number of years. You don't want to pick something that's, well, it's the cheapest to build, but boy, the annual costs to maintain it are huge. That's not the best economics. So that will all get analyzed and evaluated.
Thank you. David, I'm going to go to you, so I'm unmuting you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
A couple of sort of high level questions. One is, what is the urgency of this project balanced with what you think the timeline is? Are we sort of ahead of the curve, or are we playing catch up? That was the first question. And then the second is just sort of costs and funding. Do you have any I mean, I realize it's really early, but do you have any sort of ballpark? This is like a huge public infrastructure project. And I guess I'm just wondering if that's been thought about very much so far. I'm just curious. Yeah, just sort of these puzzle parts. How does it sort of fit together as you see it right now?
Excellent. Excellent questions, David. I like the first one on how urgent or not is this? And sometimes these timescales feel so like abstract that you can lose your place a little bit. But I would say that yeah, this is an urgent issue because this is a this is a very vulnerable area of the San Mateo County shoreline, very low lying, very urbanized. And once we start to see 1 to 2 feet of sea level rise, that water will start to become a problem pretty quickly. And then same with rising groundwater as well. What we're looking to design to is looking really far ahead in between 2080, 2100 timeframe, right? Which feels very far away, but these projects take a very long time to plan, design, and construct. And so I'm not really directly answering the first question, but I would say there's definitely urgency in getting this project continuing to progress because this is an incredibly vulnerable area. Chuck, do you want to speak to maybe some high level costs? I know I'm not quite there yet, but I do think that there's something that's kind of comparatively between the alternatives.
Yes. So these 3 draft alternatives, revised draft alternatives we've shown you tonight, we haven't yet put pencil to paper and figure out cost of those. But on the website, and you've seen the references, about a little more than a year ago, we did the initial set of feasibility studies, and we did put cost of those, and the range is anywhere from $500 million to $1 billion, depending on the alternative. Now, some of those alternatives are really no longer under consideration. The $1 billion one, just to say, would be, we didn't really talk about it too much tonight, but in lieu of pump stations and tide gates at the mouth of each creek, the only other thing you could do to prevent that water from just backing up the creeks and spilling out and flooding everyone would be to build barriers or walls along all the creeks on both sides. That was phenomenally expensive. But we did look at something pretty akin to what we're talking about here. And that, again, that was on the order of, $500 million, $600 million.
It's conceptual at this point.
Conceptual,
right? So, yeah. Don't hold us to that, but that's just some early thoughts.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Okay, we have 2 questions related to SFO. One is, has SFO seen these alternatives since they own the offshore parcels along reaches 1 and 2? And then also, Millbrae is mostly behind west of SFO. So how does SFO work into this plan?
SFO is a key partner and a key landowner for this project. So yes, they have seen these 3 draft alternatives. We've had some really helpful and instructive conversations around particularly the bird strike issue is a key one that we'll have to continue collaborating on. So yeah, both on the bird strike and wildlife management issue, and then also on land rights, like that questioner pointed out, we are continuing to collaborate with SFO, but we have met with them twice this fall and hope to continue to do so into the new year.
Thanks.
Oh, do you want to answer the question about Millbrae's mostly
thank you.
SFO? Yeah.
Yeah, and so Millbrae's the commenter is correct. It's tucked in kind of behind SFO's runway there, and actually all of Bayfront Park is owned by SFO as well. So that's SFO property. So Millbrae Shoreline is owned by SFO. So once again, just emphasizing that, yeah, they're a key partner on this project and a key landowner in this area.
Yeah, and I might quickly add that kind of the one shoreline moniker is really true here. The idea is that we link together and form a contiguous protection. So for example, if we build our project in Millbrae and Burlingame and SFO does not, it's the water just goes right around, and the converse is true as well. If SFO shouldn't say it that way, but when SFO completes their barrier, if they don't have a place to tie into, water goes around, and there are other options which, and I know they've explored, I think, a little bit. I'm not sure if it's in their environmental documentation or not, but they would have to literally wrap a wall around themselves because they have no high ground to tie into. And the problem with that is, then suddenly, how do you get in and out of the airport? So it just really emphasizes that it has to be a partnership because it is one shoreline. That's the only way this really works.
Thanks, Chuck. Yes, that's important to point out. Regional approach here is really the most effective one. So we're looking to collaborate to have that to work regionally.
Okay, could you talk more about access for recreational water users? Most of the access you've highlighted is for onshore recreational access.
Yes, and for that, I'm just going to pop up my screen real quick. I did not illustrate that in these maps, just to try and minimize the number of colors and shapes that we have going on here. But 2 points of that are opportunities for offshore recreational access. We've been coordinating with this new development. It's called Bay Rise Park. In this portion, I don't know if you see my cursor. Let me know, Violetta, if you don't see a cursor.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And as part of this development, they're looking to develop both a kayak launch ramp as well as a wind sport launch ramp along this reach of shoreline. And so we're coordinating with this development to ensure, first of all, if there are any sort of offshore, like nearshore reefs or any sort of project elements, that we would be steering clear of those launch ramps. But then also incorporating recreational access into those. So improvements to the Bay Trail, that sort of thing, we want to be coordinated with this developer on that. So that's probably the main intersection with offshore water sport access or water access. Is there anything else to add, Chuck, that I might be missing?
Yeah, maybe the only thing to add would be, and again, we're pretty early in the process, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, BCDC, they'll have a really keen interest in access to the shoreline, not only for water sports, but just for people to get into the shoreline. So we will be looking for other opportunities that make sense. And also, working with the board sailing communities and others about where a good spot might be. And when you do this, you really look at it holistically. And that includes, are there opportunities for parking, things that make this all usable. So that third component, the recreation, is really important. And this is a big part of that. Just access to the bay, making sure we have access to the bay for people who want to use it.
And we've been meeting with the Board Sailing Association, getting their input directly on these alternatives as well. Thanks.
I'm going to take Nathan's question, and then Kimberly, I see your hand up, so I'll unmute you in a moment. How do the alternatives handle rising groundwater?
Good question. Yeah, this has been a tough one because it's an emerging area of research, and we're just getting an understanding of the vulnerability to this of this area to shallow groundwater rise. And then there's this additional layer of how does that intersect with the project design. I think we would, as part of this project, definitely ensure that any project elements that are constructed as part of this effort would be resilient to rising groundwater. We would make sure we're meeting, for example, seepage requirements where any rising groundwater infiltrating that would not impact any structural elements of the project. So that's one area of thinking around rising groundwater. The more difficult area of thinking around shallow groundwater rise is how the project could protect this entire project area from shallow groundwater rise, which is a much more difficult question. We've been meeting with technical experts on shallow groundwater rise to kind of get a sense of their reactions to these alternatives. And some early input has been that more distributed pumping could be more helpful in addressing rising groundwater. But then you could have issues of land subsidence and also setting up a precedent of perpetual pumping. So there's honestly not, we're still wrestling with that question, but we are seeking input from experts on this and thinking about the ways that moving ahead as we compare the alternatives to each other and select a preferred alternative, that we are incorporating in a meaningful way metrics and criteria that speak to rising groundwater and how we can think about that for each of these alternatives. I don't know if there's anything more you want to add to that, Chuck.
No, it's really good.
Tough issue, good question.
Okay. Before I unmute Kimberly, Andrina had asked for the report that estimated the property value impacts. I just put both of the links that you had shared with me, McKenna, from before into the chat. So it's the Surging Seas Risk Finder, and then the report from County of San Mateo. So yeah.
Yep. And then if Andrina is also talking about the Millbrae and Burlingame sea level rise studies, that's the one that found the 2.4 billion number. I'll drop those in as well. So more than enough studies that speak to that question. So
Thanks. And those are available to everyone on the call. If you look in the chat, those links are there. Okay, Kimberly, I'm unmuting you.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, it was just a lot to type in. That the last thing about recreational water users, I have kayaked along this stretch. It's not a preferred stretch. Most people kayak further south or out through Coyote Point, but the Bay Area has a large community of kayakers, and there's Bay Area Sea Kayakers and Western Sea Kayakers. Both those groups are fairly large. They have these on their maps, and there's also the Bay Area Water Trail. And I just want to encourage you to take that into account, because human-powered craft like kayakers require different needs than sailboats and motorized craft, and even wind sports like kite sailing, kite boarding, windsurfing, and that. So it's really important to take that into account. And I would even suggest that you talk with somebody or one of the clubs directly about the needs, because kayakers also need emergency takeouts. If they happen to be out in the water and they experience some kind of emergency, they're going to have to come to shore. They might not make it back to the place that they, went out in. And so you need various different accessible places for them to come in if they need to. And then hard barriers also change water dynamics and can make some areas harder to navigate for various reasons. So that's important to consider as well. And then I think the Bay Area Water Trail actually does have some segments in the southern part of this little piece. And I'm wondering if all of this development will sort of take that those segments of the Bay Water Trail away. So that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Kimberly. It's super helpful. We did have the Bay SF Bay Water Trail on our list, but the other groups you mentioned I think are really important. Thank you so much. We'll be sure to follow up with those groups.
Kimberly, can I ask you for, it was Bay Area Sea Kayakers, we did reach out to them, but there was a third group that you mentioned that I didn't
Western
have.
Sea Kayakers.
Okay, Western.
They go by the acronym WISC.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, let's see, we've got a couple more questions here. During the upcoming state of alternative review, will the project include well-qualified estuary ecology experts to advise? Advice from CDWF and FWS do not provide that site study expertise.
Great question. Yes, and I know, that question's coming from, we've had a lot of great conversations with Citizens to Complete the Refuge and other really good contacts that were referred to us from that group. And so looking to follow up with those contacts and experts. We have convened a group of other technological and also ecological experts on this project from SFEI and other groups that I think we would continue to collaborate with them, and in the next round of updates to these alternatives, get their input on that, particularly on elements of the living shoreline, what that looks like. We also have experts as part of our consultant team that are looking at biological resources, both impacts and the ways that we can have greater opportunities in terms of biological resources and ecological benefits. But also we have expertise on our team that's looking at the risk related to bird strikes and airport wildlife management too. So we have both types of experts on our team, which is great. But yeah, I appreciate that question, and it's something that we'll definitely continue to tap into that expertise moving ahead on this project.
Thanks, McKenna. We have two more questions that I'm going to ask out loud. If you have any other questions, please either raise your hand or put them in the Q&A feature now. So in alternative A, it was explained that you did not plan to plant vegetation on the sloped living shoreline. Most of this area is wide open mud flat, washed with daily tides. What's to keep the tides from eroding the slope if nothing like vegetation was used to hold the man-made slope?
A good question. Yeah, once again, trying to thread a very difficult needle of not actively creating new habitat that could attract high-flying birds while also allowing for softer, shallower slopes that are not only better for human experience of the shoreline, but also for habitats. Yeah, some really helpful feedback we've gotten this fall is really evaluating in detail what are the potential erosion issues that could occur by having that more gradual slope, and if we have living shoreline elements, how to ensure that those elements are not washed out after one storm event, which has been seen in other parts of the bay with living shoreline projects. So that's something that we're taking seriously, and we'll have to evaluate in more detail our erosion risks along the shoreline. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Chuck. I know that's something you definitely had to think about for other projects.
Right, not too much. One of the things we're seeing being employed out there is something called a dynamic revetment. So for people, a very traditional way to not have that happen would be put what's known as a revetment or rock slope protection or riprap. It's large rocks, boulders that won't move in that type of environment. So I think what a lot of people are doing now, first off, going with the shallower slopes does help. So in other words, to have something not move, it could be smaller in size, and you sort of do a layering. So there's beneath it all, there's something that will stay. And if you'd seen the cross sections McKenna was showing earlier, the Bay Trail itself, the main flood protection is just a real hidden structure that won't go anywhere. And on that slope, you have different layers of things. What's down below won't go anywhere, and what's on top either becomes kind of, that's what I mean, they call it dynamic revetment. It's self-healing. Sediments will accumulate, come in and out, but it's not threatening the underlying flood protection. So it's kind of another way people put it is like there's gray green. So there's backing to everything that we're not going to lose the protection. And then what's in a dynamic environment along the bay, some erosion's natural and some deposition's natural, and you let that happen dynamically. And that's literally what it means to be alive in a sense, if that makes sense.
Thanks. Couple more came in. So when will the alternative with the least environmental impact be shared?
So I showed in that next step slide, we're looking at some time in the summer, hopefully. So we'll have this heads down period in early 2025. We'll be incorporating all this feedback, refining and updating the alternatives, and then be starting that analysis to identify the LEDPA, least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. Once that process is completed, or we have an identified draft LEDPA, that's when we would go and have this engagement period. And so we're looking at this point sometime in the summer. But we will have the most updated schedule, on our website to keep people up to date if that schedule shifts.
Okay. If more frequent, stronger storms have greater impact than anticipated, would the hard shoreline barriers cause loss of the slope shoreline and natural tide line?
I can.
Yeah, I feel like this speaks to what you just were saying too with the dynamic.
Yeah, it does a little bit. First off, that's correct, and it's kind of a well-known thing. Putting a real hardened structure can have unanticipated and adverse impacts on, think of it, the classic thing is you build a seawall and you lose the beach. So that can happen. There's a couple of things. We talked about operation and maintenance. At some point, if there's a lot of storm activity and some damage, it frankly just may need to be repaired. But you haven't lost the basic the flood protection when you do that. Or you let it be kind of more of a living and breathing thing where you get some erosion, some deposition, and it becomes very, very natural out there.
Thanks, Chuck. We're nearing the end of our time, and I see some people signing off. David had to leave, but he said thank you very much. Sloan, could you post the link to the survey one more time? There's a survey we'd love for you all to take and tell us what you thought about this event so we can improve them in the future. I'm going to take the last question and then we're going to say goodbye. So Nathan asked, naively, I would think that having a single pump station would create a single point of failure for flood control. Is that a legitimate way of thinking through the different alternatives?
Very legitimate way, but I think there's some nuance that we could talk through here. Chuck, maybe I share my screen with alternatives B and C, and you can speak to maybe what would happen if this orange box didn't work as it should.
Right. So first off, that's not naive at all. And we're very concerned about single points of failure. So when the orange box you see there is a pump station, it'll have numerous pumps in it. It will have redundant pumps. So if a pump fails, everything doesn't go down. The other thing that both alternative B and alternative C do with either the underground bypasses, the tunnels, or an open waterway, that provides some storage. So we talked a little bit about how the pump stations work. When the tides are high, they need to pump against it to keep the water on the land side low. But the tides aren't high for a day at a time. They're high for hours at a time. So if you have some storage behind the pump station and we have these operable gates, when the tides are low, the gates will open up so that water can be evacuated by gravity. So by going to something like this alternative C, there's more layers of resilience and redundancy to handle something like that. But getting quickly back to the pump stations, again, there are multiple pumps in there. We have backup power. And it is, it's kind of the reality around the bay, particularly the low-lying shoreline areas where lots and lots and lots of people just have to rely on these electromechanical infrastructure to evacuate water. There's kind of no other choice. But you're absolutely right. That's considered as part of kind of that operation implementation, safety resiliency when we evaluate these alternatives against each other. But on the flip side to that, alternative A, where you put a single pump station at the end of every creek and they're not interconnected, now they are becoming kind of potential single points of failure. But again, each one will have multiple pumps, will have backup power, but I've designed pump stations for 38 years now, and I've been out in the middle of rainstorms. sitting on buckets trying to figure out why they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So it is absolutely a critical thing we're going to think about for these alternatives.
So just to clarify on the storage piece, right? So if this orange box at the end of El Portal Creek doesn't work as it should, and maybe the redundancy in those pump stations, it's not working as it should, the water will back up along the creek channel directly. So we'll start to see flooding pretty quickly along the creek for something like alternative A. Alternative B, that water will start to back up in these tunnels first before it reaches the creek channels. So that's what Chuck means by additional storage. It's limited, but it's some space. And then alternative C, that water is going to start backing up in this near shore waterway first, before then that backup goes down the creek channels. So that's what Chuck means by additional storage.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. McKenna, over to you for last thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for very thoughtful questions. Late on a weekday night. Please let us know if you have any additional comments or questions that occurred to you after this event. Ideally by end of day tomorrow. If you can email us at, let me put it back up on the screen. mbsrp@oneshoreline.org. This email address here. Please email additional thoughts you have in the next day or so. If you need more time than that, just let us know at this email address as well. This is not the end all be all for any comments and input on this project. Of course, we will, like I mentioned earlier, return and do another series of public engagement events sometime this summer around a preferred alternative before we begin the EIR process and proceed with the project. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you all for taking time to be here tonight. Your input is so valuable, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work together on a really tough project, but a really important project for a very vulnerable area.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Night.